Hi everyone, this is Dr. V, and I'm here with a tutorial and review over the cell or the plasma membrane, giving you some of the essentials. You know, as a professor, I know some people may not understand the big picture of the cell membrane, so that's why I'm here to help you and then give you some review questions. So let's begin. So this is showing you a cell. So you see you have different parts of the cell. We have here the outside, that is the barrier of the cell. We call that the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, okay? And that's what we're actually going to talk about today. I know it looks like a little thin sheet around the cell, but it's a lot more than that when it comes to function. So the first thing you must remember regarding the cell membrane or the plasma membrane is that they're composed of a phospholipid bilayer. That is first and foremost. Phospho refers to phosphate, okay, which is an element. Lipid refers to like fats, like lipids, okay? So bi means two, layer means obviously layer. So the phospholipid bilayer is two layers, 1, 2, okay? And we have one component that's facing the outside of the cell, and then we have the other side facing the inside of the cell or the intracellular portion. I'm going to go a little bit more into the phospholipid bilayer by examining the actual phospholipid. So we can see here, you see these terms, hydrophobic tail, hydrophilic head. I'm going to talk about this. So throughout the plasma membrane or the cell membrane, you will have these phospholipid bilayers spanning the surface of the cell. But that's not the only thing there. But let's talk a little bit more about this phospholipid. All right, so if we look a little bit closely to the phospholipid, the head of the phospholipid is charged. And the reason why it has a charge is because of that phosphate group that you have present, right? The phosphate group is PO4 with a negative charge. Negative charge. That's important for you to know. That charge that comes from that functional group gives the actual quality or characteristic of that phosphate head. So we like to call that head hydrophilic, meaning water-loving, okay? And the reason why it's hydrophilic is because of that charge, so we call it a polar head. So it's a polar head. Just think P for pull. If something's pulling, that means it has some kind of charge, and that's a good way to remember that the phosphate group in the head makes it hydrophilic, meaning water-loving, and gives it that pull or that charge, that polar charge. So because of that, the properties allow the phospholipid head to face the watery environment. Okay, so it's facing either the outside or the inside of the cell, extracellular or intracellular, because that's where you find the water in the cell, whether it's cytoplasm or the extracellular fluids, whatever it may be. So remember, the head is charged, and it's charged because of this phosphate group. That phosphate group right here. You have to remember that. There is also a glycerol in the head, but that's not contributing to the actual charge. All right, so the next thing is the nonpolar tail. And there's two tails. They're fatty acids, FA, fatty acids. And fatty acids, just like fats, like if you try to mix like oil and water, because oil is a fat, it will not mix. And the reason why is because fatty acids or lipids are hydrophobic in nature. They hate water. Okay, so they do not have a charge because I don't see any phosphate groups in it. So because it's hydrophobic and hates water, we call it water hating, and it tends to face away from the water. So it will not be facing outside or inside of the cell. And because it doesn't have those functional groups that like what we saw up here with the phosphate, it doesn't have that pull or that charge, so it's non-polar. Generally, nonpolar things do not like water. And, the best way to remember, like I said, is this oil and water mix? No. So the component of the phospholipid is composed of a negatively charged phosphate head, which is polar. It loves the water, so it's facing any watery environment. And then we have our nonpolar fatty acid tails. Okay, so if you were to take a handful of these and throw them into water, they would automatically orient itself into the proper configuration. All right, so let's take a look at how it would configure. So if we take a look, this is actually the cell or the plasma membrane. You see these red structures here? That's the phospholipid. And you can see here, once again, it's showing you those hydrophilic heads, right? That's the polar, the negatively charged, the red heads right here, are the polar hydrophilic heads because of that phosphate group. And then you have those that don't like water, things that can't stand water or scared of water, those fatty acid tails, those hydrophobic fatty acid tail arranges themselves to stay away from the water, so they kind of come together. So if you were to take a handful of these phospholipids and throw them in water, it would automatically arrange itself like that. All right, so let's go a little bit more into the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. One thing you need to remember is that the cell membrane is the selectively permeable barrier of the cell. Selectively permeable. That means it does not allow everything to go in and out of the cell. Just imagine if your cell was just waving everything in. That would not be good. So because of its characteristics, it doesn't allow everything in. So let's just take a look at some of the things that can allow things to go in and out of the cell. I will talk about it a little bit later about the proteins that's found in the membrane. So here we have an integral protein, and then we also have peripheral protein. So here's another example of integral. Here's peripheral. Integral proteins, intervenes or goes throughout the membrane. So we can see here spanning all through the membrane. Integral integrates into the membrane. Integral integrates. Remember that. And in more upper division type classes or biochem class, you may learn that a lot of these proteins, like here's another integral, they have hydrophobic and hydrophilic amino acids or portions to that protein that allows it to span through the membrane. All right, and they serve several functions, which I will talk about a little bit later. The integral proteins, however, they do not span throughout the membrane. They do not go through the entire membrane. They tend to stay on the surfaces or the periphery. That's why we call it peripheral proteins. As you can see here, they stay on the periphery. They do not go throughout. There are some proteins that tend to be modified by sugars. We call those glycoproteins. We'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later. So the proteins serve an important role of signaling, bringing things in and out of the membrane. I'll talk about that a little later. Another thing I want you to remember, let me go ahead and erase some of this. There's a lot of stuff that I marked on here. Okay, so another thing I want to mention is that the membrane is not rigid. I don't know if you've ever heard of the fluid mosaic model. Excuse my handwriting. Okay. What they're actually saying in this model is that the membrane is not rigid. Things can float. There's a fluidity to it. All right, so an important component that allows this fluidity are sterols. Okay, so sterols, the one that we find in animal cells is cholesterol. So you see that there's sterols right here. If you take organic chemistry, you'll learn a little bit more about the structure of the cholesterol. But sterols in general are very important to the membrane. People say, oh, cholesterol is not good for you. Your body makes cholesterol because you actually need it for your membrane. Now, bacteria has a variation of the sterol called hopanoids. You have fungi that will have a variation called ergosterol. But when we talk about human or animal cells, the sterol that's in the cell is cholesterol. So that's actually important to maintain that integrity of the cell membrane. Other things, this is showing you the outside of the cell. Here's the inside of the cell. Let me erase some of these words so I can have some space. Okay, so I already spoke about that. Now, another thing I want to talk about are the outside versus the inside of the cell. Okay, inside of the cell, facing what we call the cytoplasmic side, there are a whole bunch of proteins and things that are interacting with the membrane. But I'll talk about that later. But I do want you to see it here, like cytoskeletons and so forth are found. So once again, to recap, this is the plasma membrane known as the cell membrane. They're composed of that phospholipid bilayer that I discussed earlier that has the polar phosphate heads, and you have the hydrophobic fatty acid tails on the inside. You have proteins that can either go completely through the membrane. We call those integral proteins, as we could see here. And then we have those proteins that only stay more surface-based, whether it's internal or external. These surface-based proteins are peripheral proteins. They do not span the entire membrane. You also have sterols that are important, like cholesterol in the animal cell, that helps with the integrity of the membrane. The membrane is fluid, okay? And one thing to remember is that the membrane is selectively permeable. And what allows that are the proteins and things that are found in the membrane and the charge of the membrane. Because remember, the phospholipid has a negative charge that can repel certain things from coming into the cell. All right, so let's focus a little bit more about those membrane proteins, because those membrane proteins are critical, okay? So if we take a look here, this is showing you once again, we have our plasma membrane, this phospholipid bilayer, but these green things that we see here, these green things, like those are membrane proteins, and I'm going to specifically talk about them because they're so important. So let's go ahead with that. So if we take a look here, let's say this is inside the cell and that's outside the cell. Here's a plasma membrane with a phospholipid bilayer, that polar head, that fatty acid tail. We do have several proteins. So let's talk about these different proteins. The first set of proteins that are found in the cell on the membrane or through the membrane are called enzymatic proteins. All right, so you know enzymes, they speed up reactions or they carry out reactions. I'll have a video on that for you guys really soon. But the enzymatic protein catalyze reactions, and they tend to be found in the membrane, especially organisms that don't have like membrane-bound organelles. They really rely on these enzymatic proteins. The next set of proteins that's found on the cell membrane or in the cell membrane are cell recognition or regulatory protein. These regulatory proteins are typically found on the cell. They can be glycoproteins, and what they do is act as ID. All right, so cell regulatory proteins are really important in IDing the cell. Okay, as we can see here, IDing the cell. If there is a foreign body inside of your system, let's say a bacteria or a virus, there will be different proteins on those entities that are foreign than it is yourself. So your body can recognize self-proteins. So example, like certain glycoproteins. If someone's having an organ transplant, there's a reason why you have to have tissue type matching, because if it doesn't match, cell recognition is going to flag it as something foreign and will reject it. Same thing with blood transfusion. If you're type A, you cannot get type B blood because the cell recognition proteins, it's going to see that as foreign and it will attack. So these cell recognition proteins are regulatory and they're essential. The next one are transport or charged molecules that can pass through, and those channels are called channel proteins. Okay, so the channel proteins, let's say you have a molecule that's charged that needs to go through. It's not going to go through the phospholipid bilayer because the phospholipid bilayer has its own charge. So it has to be brought through, and typically you have channel proteins that will allow that. Then we have carrier proteins. These carrier proteins forcibly move molecules across the membrane. Then we have cell receptor or signaling proteins. All right, these are typically require something to bind to it. And that thing that binds to it is called a ligand. And when you have a ligand binding to the receptor, it will trigger a response. So an example are hormones. Let's say protein-based hormones. Let's talk about, let's say, insulin. Insulin is a hormone. When insulin is sent into your system, that ligand, which is insulin, will dock to the surface of your cell that has insulin receptors. Once the ligand, which is insulin, binds the receptor, then there's some signal transduction or something that's going to happen to the cell that will react. Okay, so in the case of insulin, insulin will bind to the insulin receptor, and that will trigger several events that will allow the cell to take in glucose. So just to recap, let me erase these so you can see a little bit better as a review that there's different types of proteins that are found in the cell. We have enzymatic proteins that catalyzes reactions. We have cell recognition proteins that act as ID cards found on a cell that'll help your body know what's self and what's not self, and that's really important, especially for the immune system. And then you have channel proteins that would transport molecules, charged molecules, into the cell if needed. You have carrier proteins that will literally force in charged molecules, and it usually requires ATP. And then we have cell receptor or signaling proteins. The cell receptor proteins, remember, requires a ligand, something to bind to it. A perfect example are hormones. So let's take a look once again. These proteins are found all spread out through the membrane, and they're important for transport. So when we talk about selectively permeable, a lot of these enzymes will bring things in, and proteins would bring things in. And then you have those that carry out reactions or for IDing of the cell. Okay, so hopefully you guys understand or understood what I taught, the basic cell membrane essentials, because now we're going to have a quiz, so it's more of a review, and hopefully you get them. If you don't get it, I will advise you to rewatch the video to make sure you gain these concepts. They're very important. First question. The plasma cell membrane is composed of, the choices are phospholipid bilayer, proteins, sterols, or all of the above are found in the cell membrane. Let's look at it again. The plasma membrane is composed of phospholipids. So you should be asking yourself, does it have a phospholipid bilayer? Next thing, proteins. Does it have proteins? Next thing, does it have sterols? If you say that one of them don't, then you should pick it. If you think all of them are there, then pick all of the above. So let's see what the answer is. If you selected all of the above is found or are found in the cell membrane, that is awesome. So you got it. So remember, phospholipid bilayer, proteins, and sterols, they're all found in the cell membrane. Next question. The phospholipid contains, you need to select all that applies. Woo. Okay, so the first one says hydrophobic tail. Next one is hydrophilic head. Next one is hydrophobic tail. Next one, hydrophilic head. Next one, a phosphate group with a negative charge. Next one, a phosphate group with a positive charge. So I'll give you a second to take a look at it and select all that applies. It's not no eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Either you know it or you don't. Okay, so now I'm about to highlight those that are found in the phospholipid. All right, so phospholipid contains the hydrophobic tail. You remember the tail are composed of fatty acids. They hate water. It's like oil and water don't mix. So hydrophobic tail. It has a hydrophilic head. It is polar. It is charged because of that phosphate group. And hence, they have a phosphate group with a negative charge. It is PO4 with a negative charge. Okay, so if you got these, awesome. Next one. Which part of the phospholipid faces the watery environments? Is it the tails or the heads? And so before we go into the answer, remember, you got to think about what properties do these watery environments have? They obviously have water. Okay? So you got to think which part likes water? Which part of the phospholipid likes water? Is it the charged part or the part that's not charged? Remember I said that charged things like water. We call those hydrophilic. So with that said, hopefully you picked the right answer. What is the right answer? The head. The head is hydrophilic. Right, remember? It is polar in nature, so they will face the watery environments. Okay, so if you got it, great. Next one. Where are the peripheral proteins found in the membrane? So the choices are embedded completely through the membrane, found on the surfaces of the membrane, both of the above describes the location of peripheral proteins, or none of the above. Now this you should know. Let's see, what is the answer? Found on the surfaces of the membrane. That could be internal surfaces or external surfaces. Remember, only the integral protein spans completely through the membrane. So if you pick that, that is not right. It is only found on the surfaces or the periphery of the membrane. All right, next one. What is not a function / description of the plasma membrane? So first one, provides a barrier for the cell. Next one, allows only charged molecules to pass into the cell. Is selectively permeable. More than one of the above are not functions, or all of the above are functions. Hopefully you remember I'm asking not a function, okay? So reading this, hopefully you got the answer. What is the answer? Let's see. Allows only charged molecules to pass into the cell. One for one. If you see only or must, like those definite, most likely that's not the choice. But we know this is for sure not true, because you remember the membrane is selectively permeable. If it's selectively permeable, it will pick and choose who it wants to go into the cell. And remember, we have membrane proteins, so because of that, not only charged molecules can go through, you can have different things. Okay, which membrane protein catalyzes reactions? Okay, so remember that catalyze means to go through with. So let's see, channel proteins? Carrier proteins? Well, let's see. Cell recognition? Enzymatic proteins? Receptor proteins? I wonder which one it is. Which one carries out reactions? Which one catalyzes reaction? And the answer is enzymatic proteins. Okay, enzymatic proteins, they catalyze reactions, they can break things down, build things up. They're really important in the cell. All right, which membrane protein requires a ligand? Let's see, channel proteins, carrier proteins, cell recognition proteins, enzymatic proteins, or receptor proteins. I think I know the answer. Do you know the answer? If you picked receptor proteins, you are correct. All right, so ligands require receptors. Remember, I gave you the example of insulin. Okay, so when we talk about which membrane protein is responsible for rejection of foreign tissues, so that means that this protein should be responsible for your body being able to remember or know what is self and what is not self. So the only thing it could be is cell recognition proteins. All right, the plasma membrane typically allows all molecules to enter the cell. We clearly know that is not true because it's selectively permeable. All right, which sterol is normally found in animal cells? Is it ergosterols, hapanoids, cholesterol, none of the above? There was one that we see found in animal cells typically, and that is cholesterol, right? Ergosterols like in fungi, hapanoids, and bacteria, but cholesterol is what we see in animal cells. So hopefully you got 100%. If you did not get 100%, you need to go back and review the video because these are basics of the cell. And it's important for you to know the cell because every chapter typically, or every class that builds on a foundation that talks about the cell membrane, requires you to know details about it. So if you understood it, great. So please leave a comment. If you don't understand, I will help you. Maybe clarify things in a different video. But if you like it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.